Hey, so my guest today on the Entheogenic Evolution podcast is Professor Emeritus Thomas Roberts, who actually has been a guest on the Entheogenic Evolution maybe 5 or 6 years ago. I think at the time we discussed the Entheogenic Reformation. And I recently contacted Tom because he put out an article that's part of a forthcoming book, which was about your constitutional right to psychedelics. And I thought that that would be a great topic for the podcast. So, Tom, welcome back.
Thanks. I'm glad to be back.
Yeah, so just to tell a little bit about yourself, you're an emeritus professor at Northern Illinois University, and you teach a class there on foundations in psychedelic studies as an honors program. I'm just looking at your bio here on your website. Also mentions that you've been involved with Johns Hopkins Medical School. You've been a founding member of MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, and also a co-founder of the Council on Spiritual Practices, which I believe is out of the Bay Area. Is that correct?
Yes, that's Bob Jesse's group in San Francisco.
Yeah. Anything else you'd like to tell us about yourself as a bio? What are you working on right now in terms of the books that you've got going?
Well, actually, I've got two books going. One is a two-book set. Harold Ellens from the University of Michigan is editing it, and I'm contributing two chapters. And the title is Seeking the Sacred with Psychoactive Substances, Chemical Paths to Self and God. And then the chapter that we'll be talking about today is for a spin-off from that. He had so many responses from contributors that he had more articles than he had chapters to put them in. So we've started a new book that I'm co-editing with him called The Psychedelic Policy Quagmire. And it's exactly what I talked about, a psychedelic policy. So it'll look at the associated issues that have to do with policy rather than just oriented toward religion. And we don't have a due date on that yet. We think it'll be probably very late this year or very early next year.
Well, they both sound like fascinating books and definitely right up my alley, so I'm looking forward to when those are published. So let's go ahead and get into talking about the chapter on your constitutional right to psychedelics. I'd glanced through this the other week when you posted it on Facebook and just did a nice, careful read through of it this morning. And I really enjoyed the article. I think it covers a lot of different bases. And I'd love it if you would just walk us through the different ideas that you're presenting within that work.
Sure. The argument that I'm making is not one of religious freedom. That argument can be made, and I made it partially in other things. What I'm saying is that psychedelics provide a way of using our minds, and that they provide both different cognitive processes and different content. And that just as we don't believe we should censor books and their content, that we, for the same reason, we should not censor psychedelics and their content. So I'm making I'm making an intellectual freedom, academic freedom article, or arrangement rather. And what I do basically is to say that to understand this, it's helpful to use what I call multi-state theory.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a theory I developed in a book that was published about a year ago called The Psychedelic Future of the Mind. And if you look at our minds as being able to produce a large number of mind-body states in addition to our usual default awake state, then the question is, what can we do with them? What are they useful for? What do they tell us about our minds? And it's the analogy that I like to use is I use the word mind apps. And what I mean by a mind app is just as there are apps that we can install on our devices, there are mind apps we can just install in our minds. And just as the device apps allow us to do different things with our apps or with our devices, mind apps allow us to do different things with our minds. And part of what that comes to is there are new cognitive processes that we can develop, and then there are new ideas that these different processes, some that are supported and some that are criticized. So I see it as an intellectual freedom argument.
Yeah, and part of the discussion that you have here is kind of the focus in much of academics on this idea of the single state of mind that normal default a body-mind state where we have normal cognitive processes, and you discussed that there's basically a bias that's taking place there within academics and within intellectual investigation. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I've invented the name single state fallacy for that. Um, because if you name something, it's easier for people to think about it and talk about it. By no means am I the first person to say this. William James, back in 1902, wrote about the importance of different states of consciousness. I use the word mind-body state rather than state of consciousness. We can talk about that if you want, but for the time being, the idea is that we can use our minds in a lot of different ways. And of course, Charlie Tart's book, Altered States of Consciousness, is the sort of modern updating of that, and he really introduced the concept of altered state of consciousness into psychology and got it well known. And again, what he says is that if we want to develop our minds fully, we want to develop them in every mind-body state, not just our default ordinary state. And the error goes back several different ways. One is in Freudian psychology, our ordinary, rational, adult thinking, that is what he calls secondary process thinking, from a Freudian perspective, is the only thinking that's really worthwhile. And everything else gets sort of shoved down into the cesspool of the unconscious. And all the other mind-body states and all the other ways of thinking get shoved down there. But as you know, there's a lot of work with biofeedback and neurofeedback and psychoactive drugs and meditation that shows that those states actually can be very helpful if we use them. So to balance the idea of single state, I basically use the idea of multi-state and say that, well, we are creatures that have multi-state minds, and what we need to do is develop our mind in all mind-body states, not just our ordinary state. And once you see that, I mean, that's the first domino. Everything else falls into place because it means something different to have a human mind, to be educated, to know how to use it, to understand our culture and so forth. So that switch from single state to mind-body is sort of the underlying idea. And once you've got that, everything else is just elaboration.
So I think that this is a very interesting point where you're choosing to use the term mind-body states. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about why that determination of mind-body state versus just a mental state.
Yeah, okay. Well, mental would be all right. Although in psychology and philosophy, mental has a sort of bad association with it because it's sort of vague, wishy-washy. And the word that's usually used is state of consciousness, which to me is just about as bad as mental. Let me explain why. Is that when people use the same word like consciousness, and they talk with other people who use that word, they think they're talking about the same thing. But actually, consciousness has a number of very different, even conflicting meanings. So if I started to talk about states of consciousness, well, let's say somebody in philosophy might think that I'm meaning the self-reference. That is, we can think and we can think about our thinking. So that's sort of the philosophical use of consciousness. In religion, it might mean someone who is sort of more spiritual, that is, has a quote, higher level of consciousness. And in the social sciences, it can mean what somebody thinks of as being a group member, like women's consciousness or proletarian consciousness. So what I want to be clear about is what I'm talking about is a combined state of mind plus body at once, considered as one whole, not two separate things interacting. That's why I use mind-body state rather than state of consciousness.
Well, I think it's a really excellent distinction, and I like that it draws attention to the embodied aspect of it, because of course especially when we're talking about psychedelics, we are talking about something that is affecting us at a physical level that is also producing changes in consciousness and changes in perception, changes in the way that we think and experience and identify, and that this is all related to our physical nature, and our physical nature is intimately combined with the mental nature that we experience, and that they're part of the same whole. So I like that emphasis.
I'm glad it works. Yeah, I want to get across that we're talking about, when we're talking about psychedelics, we're talking about chemical bodily things, that's the interesting thing is you can take a chemical and it'll affect people's not only perceptions and the way they hear music, but actually the ideas they have. And because it affects the ideas they have, that's what makes this an intellectual freedom issue.
Hmm. So early on in your paper here, I'm looking at it on the computer right now. You say, which domains do psychedelics fall under? And then you have a list here. And we have health, law, science, arts, religion, philosophy, humanities, business, politics, education, recreation. And then the last one says, all of the above. And he's right. Of course, the answer is all of the above. And it's even more complicated than that. In each of these domains, psychedelics can be both useful or destructive depending on who uses them, how skillfully they are used, and even where they are used. So maybe if you could tell us a little bit about how you went about constructing this list here and different ways that you see applicability of psychedelic and cognitive freedom as relating to them.
Okay, well, remember, this is a book on policy,
Mm-hmm.
psychedelic policy. So what I'm trying to point out in that list is that people who are considering policy have to consider psychedelics at every one of those different fields. Okay, it's not just a health matter, it's not just a law matter. And this is what makes it such a quagmire of ideas, because every one of those fields has its view of what psychedelics could be and should be. And within each of those fields, there are psychedelics that are used skillfully and well and used unskillfully and dangerously. So the field becomes complex extremely fast. For example, in psychotherapy, we all know the work that's being done now, let's say with PTSD or Grof's work or the work with fear of dying. So that's done very well. But there are people who are taking psychedelics and hoping to sort of prescribe for themselves. And unless psychedelics are taken in a pretty controlled situation, in a lot of cases that doesn't work out well. So, and this applies at every one of these levels. For example, we probably both, let's take the last one, recreational use.
Mm-hmm.
We probably both know people who use psychedelics recreationally and had a wonderful time and heard music for the first time or saw deeper colors and so on and so forth. On the other hand, we probably both know people who done psychedelics and had really bad trips and were sort of like confused afterwards or
Mm-hmm.
didn't feel well for the next day or two. So every one of these topics, and there's this whole list, has multiple perspectives on it. And poor policymakers, I say in the article that I don't try to present a policy, but I hope that I will lay out the issues to how policymakers look at it. And it's not just policymakers, but each one of these is an ethical issue. So ethicists have to get in on this at the same time.
I think it's really important that you're showing the complexity of the issue here, because I know that a lot of people want to approach it either strictly from a health issue and looking at, well, we can use these for therapeutic uses. Others are just looking at, say, religious freedom issues. But I like that you're expanding it into all these areas, and that within your article you're talking about ways that they might be applicable within these different areas. And then also, I'm kind of skipping ahead here, but towards the end you have sort of some imaginary scenarios of people engaging with psychedelics and then kind of asking, well, what are the policy issues related to this kind of situation or related to this kind of situation? And so you're really showing the breadth of the complexity of this issue, and it's kind of reflecting back on your idea of the single state versus the multi-state in terms of cognitive awareness, that we kind of have the same thing going on here, that it's not just a single issue, but it's actually a multiplicity of issues. And our policy as it stands right now is just far too simplistic to deal with the complexity of what's really going on here and the potentials for where psychedelics might be applied within culture.
Yes, yes, that's the problem. And if we ask ourselves, okay, now who knows enough about this to make an informed, wise decision? The answer I come up with is no one. All right, because you just would have to understand its use in all these different fields, or you'd have to get a group of people together who would be able to look at the various uses within each field and then come up with some standard policy. Or probably it'll be a collection of different policies for different fields. In medicine now, we're working toward a fairly clear policy of screening subjects and preparing them and sitting with them during the session and integration afterwards. Now, what would that mean for, let's say, the arts? Suppose one's a musician or a visual artist. I mean, what would be the appropriate use for them? Or a businessman who has a, a question he wants to solve, or an innovator who's trying to figure out a new use for something or a new gadget or something. What would be the right use for them? So all these things have to be looked at. And also, whatever policy we're going to come up with, we'll try it out for a while, and we're bound to find that it'll need revision and refinement. So this is a long, ongoing process that we're in.
Mm-hmm. So in your article here, you do have a little bit of a history of psychology, and so you have the psychology of the 50s, and you have, what's the next, the curse of the 60s. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about this history that you've included here within this essay.
Yeah. When psychedelics, it's hard for us to imagine this now, but when psychedelics first were developed and started to be used, I mean, of course, Hoffman's experience was in the 40s. They didn't start to be used in psychotherapy much until the 50s and 60s. At that time, there were two major schools of psychology, and psychedelics didn't fit into either one. The controversy was between basically the psychodynamic Freudian-like psychologists and psychotherapists, and their view of mental problems was that it went back to some sort of mistreatment during childhood. Behaviorists thought that the problems that people had was a result of their punishment or reinforcement again to childhood. And so psychedelic drugs didn't fit in the picture at all. Not only that, with the Freudians, the production of a non-standard, non-default state of consciousness, their rational secondary process thinking, would be considered sort of a inferior cesspool type thinking. From behaviorists, it's incredible how much we didn't know. I actually started out cutting my teeth as a behaviorist, so I was very much a behaviorist. And our idea at the time was that the mind, the brain, is basically, quote, a black box. Or imagine it's like an aquarium with the walls painted black. Stuff is going on in there. You don't know what it is, but it doesn't make any difference because the brain works pretty much the same, and what counts is the outside stuff. So something that went into the aquarium and sort of started messing things up there was seen as a brain damage, or at least temporary poisoning, and psychoactive drugs were seen in that light. And this applies to, the tranquilizers and then the amphetamines that were developed in the 1950s. And they were seen as sort of messing up the brain. I mean, we know so much about the brain now, and we have all these medical psychoactive drugs that are used, and they're the main line in psychiatry, that it's hard for us to realize, looking back, this is like, a generation or even two ago, people didn't think that there was anything going on in the mind you had to pay attention to, or if it was just memories and emotional things that went back to childhood. So psychedelics are sort of born into this controversy. And not only didn't they fit the image of a way to approach human behavior through the mind, but also they were part of this weird idea that there's stuff you could take that would actually help the way that the brain and the mind function. So they ran into this sort of double whammy from both directions. And then when they finally started to be used, what happened was that now, as you know, most psychiatric work is prescription drug work. Mm-hmm. And the idea of spending time with the patient and talking with the patient is something most psychiatrists don't do. But the use of psychedelics in psychotherapy means basically spending all day with the patient or the client in an all-day session and being with the client during all day. And so this doesn't fit into our current model of, go to the psychiatrist, tell him your problems, he'll prescribe a drug for you, and you go to the CVS and get it filled. And so psychedelics are now sort of accepted that there are such things as psychoactive drugs, but the fact that you have to use them in an all-day session and insurance companies aren't willing to pay for that, really means they aren't used as much as they should do. Although we're making good progress. The work on PTSD and death anxiety is really wonderful. They are doing excellent work, and it meets all kinds of high medical and psychological and scientific standards. So I think this is going to open the door to the future.
And another distinction that you have in this section of the essay that I think is a really important one is that you do talk about how with many of the psychoactive drugs that are used in a therapeutic context, they're a bit more mechanical and predictable in their action, whereas if you give someone a tranquilizer, that person will be tranquilized. If you give someone something that's going to alter their mood or their cognitive processes, that you're going to get that result. So it is a matter of you can go in, you can say, hey, look, this is my problem. Can you prescribe something? And then they give you a pill, and then it gets the effect that supposedly that you want. And the difference with psychedelics is that there is not a preset standard for what you're going to get when you take the psychedelic. So of course you have some important discussions of the ideas of set and setting and how that plays into what is actually produced by the psychedelic and the action that it's imposing upon the individual.
Yes, I mean, imagine if you're a doctor and you prescribe a drug to somebody, several people, and you find out the effect is random. This is not a drug you want to prescribe. Well, psychedelics have what seem to be random, but of course we know basically what it is it's the expression of the unconscious coming out, and the set, that is the unconscious and the expectations, and the setting where the person is when he or she takes the drug. So this then was, it seemed like they were just random drugs that would have random effects with no possible psychotherapeutic use, until basically people like Grof realized you could use them as a way of exploring the mind and bringing material up from the unconscious to consciousness, and then work through it in a psychotherapeutic process. So that's the use of them. Although actually there are two uses. One is the one I just mentioned, which is bringing material up from the unconscious, repressed memories, and then working it through with psychotherapy. And the other one is a strong, overwhelmingly positive peak experience or mystical experience. And those are different techniques that are used different ways, and they have apparently different mechanisms of action.
So something that's kind of interesting with the history of all this, especially when we look at things like, say, philosophy and psychology, that if we go back to the turn of the last century, we did have people like William James, and there were a few others that were experimenting with certain psychedelics, mescaline, also nitrous oxide, which maybe we don't want to classify as a psychedelic, but classifies it as something. And so like William James is writing his book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, and kind of getting into, as you're discussing, sort of this multi-state version of the mind and human experience. Is there a reason that you can think of why that was not more actively picked up by psychology, or were they just not paying attention to people like William James, or was it not of interest? Where do you think that comes about?
I haven't really thought that through. The idea that occurred to me right away is that in the early part of the 20th century, religion was being separated from the sciences. And of course, this is, as you said, is in varieties of scientific, of religious experience. And so people didn't really want to get into the religion topic, particularly psychologists. Also, at that time, there was increased interest in the physiology of psychology. James basically was both a philosopher and a physiologist. So that certainly came along. And then along with the growth of Freudian psychology, remember, interpretation of dreams was dated 1900 because Freud wanted to be sort of opening the session. At that point, from Freud's perspective, religion was this sort of atavistic, unconscious desire to have mom and dad protecting us, or a fear of punishing dad. So that sort of lent a lot of sort of fear and official disinterest in studying religion. And in universities at this time, philosophy departments were often dropping religion courses if there were state institutions, or there would be a department of religious studies and a department of philosophy. And so those started to diverge at that time. So there were these big cultural changes that were going on that discouraged that.
Yeah, and it's certainly not much better these days where philosophy departments are still very much divorced from religious studies departments. I mean, I myself, I have my undergraduate degree in philosophy and my graduate degree in religious studies, and the reason why I had to do it that way is because the things that I wanted to study philosophically weren't available within the philosophy department, and part of it was altered states of consciousness. I had to go to a religious studies department in order to look at that and to access the cultural material that's available there.
Yeah, that's a your perfect case study. Yes, and there are a lot, as you know, there are a lot of people who are in that situation who are interested in the mind and interested in whether the mind has a spiritual aspect. If so, what that means and how we get there. And this is where the path of transpersonal psychology sort of cuts into this, because it recognizes a desire for transcendence of the ego, which may or may not be interpreted in a theistic way, and wants to take a psychological approach to that. And this is one of the areas that we're hoping to get an article from Jim Fadiman on this, on um, the problem with psychology and transpersonal psychology. There's a new book, handbook of transpersonal psychology that came out just a couple months ago, and it'll have a lot of articles along those lines.
So, I would like to get back into some of the things you mentioned about Grof, but before we get there, just again, looking at your article, you have a quote from the Office of National Drug Control Policy Reauthorization Act of 1998. And just part of it here says, um, no federal funds appropriated to the Office of National Drug Control Policies shall be expended for any study or contract relating to the legalization for medical use or any other use of a substance listed in Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act, and take such actions as necessary to oppose any attempt to legalize the use of a substance in any form. And I just think that this is quite telling, and it actually reminds me of how recently there was a conference or something was done with the National Drug Control Policy, where the person in charge was asked about, is marijuana medically safer than alcohol? And she refused to answer that question. And I know she got a lot of flack for that, because all the studies have shown that certainly marijuana is far safer than alcohol. But because this is their charter, that she has to get up there and basically lie, because she can't say anything that might be interpreted as supporting legalization or changing the schedule of the substance. So this is the kind of policy that we're dealing with here.
Yes, I mean, that's exactly right. And you're right. She was on a difficult spot because the law from Congress that she was following refused or prohibited her from saying anything about that. And she knew, I think that her not responding is the best thing she possibly could have done, and
Yeah.
still, maintained her position. Now, the reason that came up, I've got it in an article off the MAPS forum, was that there was or is a law being considered now in Congress that will remove that restriction. And I don't know where we are in that process, but that the idea was to remove that restriction on it.
Well, that seems like a very important item that would need to be addressed, because how can we have a rational policy discussion if up front their policy is that they have to oppose everything and that they can't actually acknowledge the latest science on any of these issues? That it'd be impossible to get anywhere if that is the policy of the federal government. How can we have a real conversation?
That's right. Now, the medical research is a way of end running around that problem. It doesn't solve it, but at least temporarily it allows, people in medical schools to do research on psychotherapeutic uses of psychedelics. But right, it doesn't really get at the problem. And as the research is coming along, I think it's becoming more and more obvious that used skillfully, psychedelics are very helpful in psychotherapy. And of course, all the marijuana stuff that's going on, the state laws and I mean, this is going to change. This is clearly changing, and like almost every day, I get something from Marijuana Policy Project about, some state legislators passed this and the governor has signed that. So that's clearly moving along.
Yeah, I will say, as much as a quagmire as it is, that I'm certainly very hopeful about these policy debates that are now starting to take place. And I think that marijuana is one of these key linchpin issues that if we can move the government to talking rationally and realistically about this issue, that I think it will help with what are considered to be these more serious substances of the psychedelics, that it will help inject some reality into the conversation, I think.
I sure hope so. We are intentionally not including marijuana under psychedelics,
Mm-hmm.
but see that as a separate field of its own. And in my own mind, marijuana either barely qualifies as a psychedelic or doesn't qualify as a psychedelic, and it probably has to do with the THC content in the leaf. So it might sometimes be a psychedelic and sometimes not, and that is we're treating that as a separate issue. But of course, it's a related issue.
Yeah, because we are talking about a plant, we are talking about a chemical, and we are talking about a Schedule 1 listing, and just all of the issues that are related to that. And I do think that there are a lot of positive developments that are taking place there that certainly give me hope. When I was young and first got into legalization issues, like back when I was in high school, that I never would have imagined that we'd be having the discussions that we're having now, that we'd be seeing states moving ahead with marijuana as medicine and also going straight for legalization, that I didn't think we'd ever get here, but yet here we are. So it gives me hope for other substances as well.
Yeah, yeah, that really is amazing progress. I'm tempted to say it happened overnight. Of course, those of us in the field know it hasn't been overnight, but it certainly seems like the public is changing its attitudes overnight. And also, there are some pharmaceutical companies that are looking at the marijuana-derived medicines. In fact, the FDA has even approved a phase 3 study for the use of an extract of marijuana for cancer pain. And so, I mean, the FDA will approve things provided they meet the scientific rigor that's necessary. So some people think, oh, they'll never approve marijuana, or why they would never approve this study. But as long as they're scientifically rigorous and medically careful, they are getting approved.
Mm-hmm. So getting back into some of the content of your article here, some things that I'd be interested to talk a little bit more about is you have an interesting section on inventing paradigms, where you're talking about Benny Shannon's work with antipodes
Yeah.
of the mind, and you also have a very interesting discussion of Grof's work and kind of using his analysis for the arts and also political situations. So there's lots of interesting material here. Maybe we could talk about some of it. Maybe we could start with the inventing paradigms section.
Yes. Keep in mind that what I'm looking at here is making the argument that psychedelics have a valid academic and intellectual use.
Yes.
So, of course, somebody says, well, where? So, Benny Shannon's work is an example of this. He's a very well-respected cognitive psychologist in Israel, and he went on vacation to Brazil, and I think you can see where the story is going, got interested in ayahuasca, and as a cognitive psychologist asked, what is going on here? Because he was having cognitive processes that he didn't know existed. So, I mean, this is absolutely fascinating to a scientist to discover something new. So he spent a lot of time in Brazil having his own sessions and talking to Brazilians and talking to North Americans and Europeans who had sessions, and sort of collected this vast amount of work on the cognitive aspects of ayahuasca that he published in his book called The Antipodes of the Mind. And what he did in there is to basically collect the ideas that seem to be freshest, most unusual to cognitive psychologists. And he listed them and basically said that what this does is to enrich or you can say undermine current cognitive psychology, because it points out that cognitive psychology has not paid attention to a lot of the things that it should. And so what he's done there actually is to invent a new paradigm of cognitive psychology that includes all these other parameters, or you can say he's enriched the current paradigm by including these other things that people hadn't been paying attention to. So I think what he had stumbled on, although he doesn't present it exactly in these words, is that he may have stumbled on a way to invent new paradigms, that you just don't have to wait for odd things, anomalies to occur and accumulate so much that you see you need a new paradigm, but there are actually something we can do to accumulate anomalies. And what I'm interested in, of course, is that psychedelics may be a way not only of cognitive psychologists, but scholars and graduate students in all these fields to get fresh perspectives on their fields and to find out bits about the human mind that have been missed. And because people have used that single state fallacy, they haven't paid attention to aspects of the mind that are in other states. So, I mean, we could take anybody in the social sciences, well, biological sciences or philosophy. I would particularly like to see philosophers get into this,
Yes.
to have an expanded view of the human mind, and to ask, okay, what does this indicate about the mind that we haven't paid attention to? And then what that means, of course, is you're inventing a new paradigm for whatever field you happen to be in. And I think could be a real breakthrough. And I think one of the uses of psychedelics in academia would be what I call conceptual research methodology, is you would actually prepare graduate students and have them experience different mind-body states, and then bring back their insights from those states to the ordinary state and test them out and see if they're valid ones. Another point here, by the way, is that when we're talking about mind-body states, it isn't just psychedelics, but it's different types of meditation and martial arts and neurofeedback and transcranial magnetic stimulation. All these things are ways of getting into doing different things with our minds and our brains. And so psychedelics are just one slice of a much larger pie, although that's the slice we're paying attention to it now.
Yeah, I think kind of Benny Shannon's personal statement within his book kind of speaks to the power of these experiential states, because he does write in his book about how he started off his investigation as pretty much a strict atheist materialist, and he said that he did not adopt any of the religious views of the people that he was working with or interviewing for his book, but he said that by the time he was finished with his research, he was definitely not a strict atheist materialist anymore, that it had challenged his preconceptions so strongly and presented so many interesting anomalies for him that he had to leave that particular paradigm behind. And he ends the book with a lot of interesting philosophical questions and discussions, so he doesn't proclaim that he's figured it all out, but he does say that, well, look, there's really something going on here that deserves a great deal more attention than what it's been given. So I think it serves as an excellent example of how the psychedelic state can challenge pre-existing assumptions and help open up new possibilities, as you say, for creating new paradigms.
That's a version of my story too, because when I first started taking psychedelics, that was in 1970. I was basically an agnostic. I had been reared in a congregational church in Connecticut, and sort of thought I had left that behind me. And then later that year and several times afterwards had these sort of blowout mystical experiences. And I realized that religion isn't just about what it says in some religious text or what a clergyman says or this history of ideas that's developed over thousands of years and sort of the slow accretion of behaviors and thoughts and beliefs, but there's an experience at the center of religion, and that to me is like one of the really big insights. And so I basically started taking religion seriously, not as a belief system but as an experiential event. And when you make that switch, then the question is, well, where else does this event show up? Are there other ways of having it? And of course, a lot of meditators have started off in psychedelics and look for more easier path, smoother path to get into it. So yes, that's one big one. And of course, this is a religious freedom issue as well as an intellectual issue, because if one's openness to the possibility of spirituality is increased with psychedelics, then prohibiting psychedelics prohibits a person or the culture in general from accepting that idea. And this is an example of censorship. Now, it isn't intentional censorship. I mean, Congress didn't sit down and say, we don't want people to have this experience because it'll change their religion. But this is an undesirable side effect.
And I really like the discussion that you have in the essay about, well, what constitutes a sincerely held religious belief. Like you mentioned, well, Judaism basically starts with one person, or possibly two if we include
Right.
Abraham and Sarah. And then Christianity starts with really just 13 people. So often when things end up in the courts in the United States, that they look at, well, how long has this been established? Is there a history here? How many people? Is there a sacred text? Like I remember speaking with Robert Forty, and he was talking to me about how he tried to establish a psychedelic church. I think it was back in the 80s, and when it ended up in court, the judge basically said, well, there's no history here, therefore it's completely invalid. And so you're raising these questions of, well, how do we determine what is a valid religious practice or religious belief? And really, who are the courts to decide if they don't have any expertise in this area?
Yes, that's the real nub of a very difficult issue. And if you were making a case in court, one of the laws is all or approaches is always to present the best evidence that's available, and the best evidence that's available is that experience. So let's say if you wanted to say something is you believe because it's in the Bible, you could bring in a Bible and show it. But if you say this is the religion I have because of the experience I've had, the only way to get that across is to give somebody else that experience. Now, I can't imagine the Supreme Court. Well, I can imagine actually, going through psychedelic sessions. But to judge on this and be best informed, they and all the intermediate judges, in districts down to local districts, would have to have these experiences, or at least recognize that other people have the experiences and that these are legitimate experiences, and that the experience then gives rise to religion. That religion isn't just a accumulation that's happened over thousands of years of ideas and hopes and practices. Yeah, this is a very difficult issue. And I think this is where religious studies programs should get into this. I mean, any religious study program that doesn't pay attention to psychedelics is basically not doing its job. It's leaving off an important part. And of course, we're seeing this. I mean, there's a huge literature now on religion and psychedelics, and it's showing up. I mean, going back into archaeology and history and the arts and music. So the field is developing very nicely, but there still are people looking for graduate programs. Every winter, I get emails from, let's say, college students who are looking for a program saying, where can I go to study whatever? And I have to tell them, well, if you're going to be a psychotherapist, there are places you can go. Although still there are no ads for psychedelic psychotherapists. But if you're going to be, an anthropologist, a literary person, or a social scientist, you have to learn whatever the standard of the field is and then hope you can orient your field in that direction. I was lucky to be able to do that. My background actually is in educational administration and psychology. And then I worked that around to teaching a psychedelics course once a year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would just want to strongly agree with you that I think that all religious studies departments should be teaching classes about psychedelics and religion, and I think it's just a shame that many of them don't. That I teach here at Southern Oregon University as an adjunct professor. I'm the only person who teaches religion at the university, and I get students in, and they're generally really shocked at first when I tell, because I always start my classes by talking about religious experience and how religions develop out of experience. And so then I relate the history of psychedelics and how they've been used in many different religions over many millennia. and students are just, they're shocked. They had no idea. And at first they react like, who is this guy? What are we learning in this class? And then eventually there'll be a few by the end of the term who come up and they want to know, well, how can I experience this? And fortunately here in Ashland, I'm able to point them to either the Native American church or the Santo Daime church if they're really curious and they really want to experience that there are places I can point them towards. But it's also limited in the sense that, well, you can go to the Santo Daime and you can go drink daime, but then you're also going to get a lot of daime doctrine and their beliefs. Or if you go to the Native American church, you'll get the same thing. And so it's not a neutral opportunity for them, that it's something that comes in a package. So I think that it provides them some access, but there's also a lot of limitations there. Whereas if we can incorporate that into the curriculum itself, that would be a completely different kind of education.
Yes, it sure would. In fact, I designed a course called Entheogens, Sacrilege or Sacraments, which I haven't taught. But the syllabus, now several years old, is on my website, and we might use it in a chapter in one or another of these books. But yes, and as you know, there's a lot of material out there. My favorite probably would be Houston Smith's "Cleansing the Doors of Perception," because he is so well known, and like almost anybody who's used a comparative religion book has probably used one of his books. Because basically he had the field to himself for decades, although other people are in it now too. So yes, and those are a collection of articles that he had written over the years about psychedelics. And that, by the way, that use, I reserve the word entheogen for religious uses. So I don't use psychedelic and entheogen as substitutes for each other, but I talk about the entheogenic use of psychedelics, just as you might talk about the medical use of psychedelics.
Right.
And there's some argument in the field of whether you should just use the word entheogen as a substitute for psychedelic. I don't think so, because to me that has a very clear religious, the theo was right there as part of the word.
Yeah.
So that'll be reserved for spiritual topics.
Maybe we can get back into some of the material that you include from Grof's work and how you're looking at applying that into other contexts outside of the psychedelic psychotherapeutic use.
Yeah. Grof's map of the mind is one that I find extremely useful in looking at myself and looking at things going on in society. As your listeners might know, he was a psychiatrist at Charles University in Prague, and then came to this country in the 1970s and ran a psychedelic research center at Catonsville, Maryland, associated with Johns Hopkins. And then was a scholar at Esalen and has written probably 12.5 books on psychedelics. And he discovered the use of psychedelics, as he called them, as mental amplifiers. That is, like a microscope to the mind, they amplify what's going on in the mind and bring unconscious materials to the surface. So one particular part of what he sees is a level he calls perinatal, meaning having to do with birth, not prenatal, but perinatal. And it has to do with the idea that at a very deep level of our unconscious, we actually can remember our own fetal and birth experience. But this is very repressed and seldom manifests itself, except it does in unconscious ways, the way the unconscious influences us. So I use his perinatal theory, which has 4 stages parallel to birth, to analyze films and poems, songs. In my class, probably the best assignment I have is, after we've read Grof's books, LSD, Doorway to the Numinous is the new title. I have my students use the perinatal theory and to describe something in their life. It might be a movie or a play or driving a car or a relationship or even moving into a new apartment, and to use those 4 stages as a way of analyzing how they felt about those experiences. A particularly odd one that I thought would not work at all was one woman in my class who bought a new pair of shoes and wanted to use perinatal theory to describe the new pair of shoes and wearing them to a dance. I thought, well, let's see what you can do. It turned out a really good presentation. It's a very rich set of ideas, and it allows us to look at our own experiences, but also cultural artifacts like movies. Actually, one of my next projects is to do an analysis of the movie Pink Floyd The Wall, and it fits into both the four-level theater, four-level theory, and the perinatal level very well. It's an extremely rich series of ideas. And once you start using them, you find that, like any other idea, the more you use it, the more you're likely to get skilled at using it. So I really recommend Grof's theory.
Yeah, here in your paper, you have it applied to the history and rhetoric of war. You have it for philosophy, art criticism, mythology, religion, cinematic criticism. So you really are showing that these ideas, again, that are developed out of experiential states with psychedelics, have many applications outside of even the psychedelic experience itself. So part of this opening up of the discussion is really about how can we apply these ideas and these experiences to other areas of culture and life. And I think that it's a really brilliant argument because, of course, all of human culture, all the products of human culture come out of the human mind and the human experience. And with this amplification of the human mind and experience with psychedelics, that it's only natural to think that we might be able to understand more of what humans are doing and producing if we can understand the psychedelic state.
Yes, and those ideas are sort of chilling, have a chilling effect because they're based on psychedelics. And that's part of the censorship problem. A way to explain this often is people recognize, I mean, there's Freudian analysis of works of art, and there's Jungian analysis, and now we have Grofian analysis. So it just lays another layer of richness in understanding culture.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit more about the chilling effects. You have a couple different sections here in the paper on this issue.
Okay, well, a standard freedom of religion, freedom of thought, freedom of press issue is something called a chilling effect. And that means that certain ideas or practices or meetings are looked down upon and sort of given a hard time culturally. That's called the sort of chilling effect. Imagine you went outside on a chilly day and you wouldn't feel very comfortable. And because these ideas came from a psychedelic background, there's a chilling effect, and many people sort of dismiss them automatically and say, well, that's just some sort of hippie falderall, or some guy lost his mind and imagined this, so forth. So the historical background and psychological background sort of makes these ideas less acceptable. And this is one of the things that I want the culture to get over. And in fact, basically what I'm doing with my life is trying to get these ideas accepted into culture in various fields. So this is the academic road along those lines. So anyway, that's what that is. That chilling and chilling effect is recognized in the courts. If it's seen as one of the problems of censorship, and if you can show that a certain action has had a chilling effect on ideas, that action there has to be re-examined and perhaps stopped. So that's what that argument is.
Mm. So then this would be something that someone can potentially take to court and say that because of the way that our policies are constructed, that it's actually inhibiting academic and intellectual freedom.
That's exactly right, yes. And I hope that professional academic and civil liberties union organizations will get onto this, that this is a restriction in the ideas we can talk about and the ideas we can use, and it's impoverishing the intellectual, religious, and cultural area.
So let's talk a little bit more about the complexities of policy. And I'm thinking specifically here of some of these hypothetical situations that you have, or who knows, maybe they're not even hypothetical situations. Maybe these are actual cases of people that you know that comes towards the end of your essay where you have a religion example, you have a medical example, a scholarly example, a personal freedom example. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about these.
These are suggested by actual events, but they're not actually descriptions of actual events. And the first one is the religious freedom angle. I'm calling this person Crazy Tom, and he wants to do psychedelics as a religious for religious reasons. And the question is, should we believe him, or is he just using this as a shield so he can do psychedelics and say, well, I'm doing it for a religious reason, you can't touch me? And how would the courts go about deciding that? And that's where I bring up this issue of when religions started, there weren't very many people. So he could say, well, I'm starting a new religion. Abraham did it by himself or with his wife, so I want to do it by myself or with my wife. So that is where that issue comes up. And the question is, how is the court going to determine what makes a religious issue a religion? And as I mentioned with Bob Forty, the judge wanted to know, is there a text? Is there standard meetings? Are there all these organizational things that religions do? And if not, then in his case, the court decided it was not a religion. But from a psychedelic mystical experience perspective, beliefs and organizations and rights and ethics are derived from these basic experiences. The basic experience is the root that these other things grow from. So that's the argument that stands behind this. And the question is, how can a court determine whether this is a legitimate spiritual religious use or just some guy who wants to trip and says, well, it's my religion? And I don't have a good answer for that.
Yeah, it actually reminds me of an article I was reading just this morning about a marijuana church in Hawaii that got busted, and they had to go to court, and apparently it was just decided, it was either yesterday or sometime very recently that this was decided, according to the article, that the courts argued that it was not a legitimate religion because they posted on their website that if you join the church, that this will give you a religious freedom protection. So they said, well, you guys just want to smoke pot and you're using religion as an excuse. And so they used that portion of their website as an argument against them.
I'm completely unfamiliar with that case, but I can see the court deciding it that way.
Yeah, it's an interesting case when courts and judges are the ones that are determining what is a legitimate religion or not. And I don't know if any judges actually take religious studies courses or if they have any education there. So it's kind of an odd case where someone is required to be a judge and expert on a topic that they might not really know anything about.
The courts hate religion cases. They'd rather see almost maybe anything else come along. And that's the reason, because if they make a decision, whatever decision they make, they are establishing or not establishing a religion. And of course, there's the constitutional prohibition about establishing a religion.
Yeah.
So they're really caught on this. And this is one of the unresolvable constitutional issues, I think, because the courts do not want to say this is a religion, this isn't a religion. A good case of that was the Native American church and use of peyote in the early 1900s. 1990s. And the court took the case of two Native Americans who had used peyote and were fired from their jobs and applied for workman's compensation because they were fired, but were denied because they were fired for drug use. And they claimed a religious exemption on this. And the court actually decided against them. And there was an outroar throughout the religious community. Everything from the far west to the far east, the north and the south, religions all over the place actually put the pressure on Congress to establish the Religious Freedom Act. And there was another one following, particularly for the Native American Church. And this is probably the only time practically all religious groups in the United States agreed on anything, because they were afraid that what the court was doing was deciding what is and isn't a legitimate religion, and they see that as their province. That's part of that law versus religion thing in that first question. And how do we resolve that.
Yeah. Something that I like to tell my students who take my religious studies courses is that, in my opinion, I think it should be a required class. I think everyone should have to take a class in religious studies because it influences so much of human history and human culture. And I think the more educated we are on it, I think the better, which I don't expect anyone to be a believer in anything. And I'm certainly not teaching religious studies classes to convert anyone to any particular view. But I think that the more knowledge we have about it, just the more educated we are as human beings, considering how significant religion has been and continues to be for humans across the world. It's boggles my mind that it isn't considered part of a basic education.
Well, I agree with you, but I've never met a professor who didn't think the students should take more courses in his field.
Yes.
Right? That's part of our personality. But I really think you've got the argument. I really do.
Yes. There's one example that I really like here is your scholarly example. Maybe you can tell us about that with your character of Eric Mills in his doctoral dissertation.
Yeah, well, this is based on a historical event, but I'll talk about the thing. Um, uh, let's imagine a student whose background was in chemistry and got a master's in chemistry, and then got interested in classical studies and decided to study ancient Greece and Rome. Well, because he was interested in chemistry, he carried that knowledge with him, and he was also interested in botanical chemistry. And as he started reading these ancient texts, he realized, or he interpreted, that they were talking about psychoactive plants.
Mm-hmm.
And so here he was, I mean, having this good background and insights that people hadn't had before. And so he wrote a dissertation on the use of psychoactive plants in ancient Rome and Greece. Well, his dissertation advisor, who's almost a classical stereotype of the sort of classics professor, was enraged to think that the rational, careful, wonderful Romans and Greeks would possibly have done psychoactive drugs. What a scandalous idea. And he insisted that this guy remove all reference to that from a dissertation, or dissertation would be refused. Mm-hmm. Well, he did. He removed it to get his dissertation, and then he wrote a book, okay, about his experience and about what he found. And of course, other people, Carl Ruck is probably the best known, have talked about the use of psychoactive drugs in ancient Greece.
Yes.
So this field has developed since then. But the question then is, suppose he wants to go to the graduate dean and appeal to the graduate dean and say, I want to show you my evidence, and the best evidence is I've got a psychoactive mushroom here. If you take this, you will understand why they did so in ancient Greece and Rome. Okay, now what does the graduate dean do in this case? Okay, or if he goes to the guy's colleagues in the department, what are they going to do? Are they going to say, no, we won't accept the best evidence? And of course, in scholarly work, this is like sin number one, is not to accept the best evidence. And okay, here's the problem that academia is approaching and really has not addressed.
Yeah. So I've already had you on for about an hour now. So if we could maybe wrap it up with what, in your view at this point, what's the ideal world that we're working for here in terms of cognitive liberty, psychedelic liberty, and how you would see that as then incorporated into things like education, as we've just been discussing?
I think the big idea we have to recognize, and the idea that underlies all this, is that our minds are capable of producing and using a large number of different mind-body states. Those are like the applications we can install on our minds. And when we see that, the idea of what it means to have a mind greatly expands. It isn't just the education of our ordinary awake state, which is what most education is, but all the questions get re-asked for every other mind-body state and for every way of reaching them. Neurofeedback and meditation and chanting and psychedelics. So this just blows the roof off the academic world, and also the medical and legal and religious worlds, because we approach it means something much more to be a human. It means to have a mind that'll work in a lot of different, quote, programs or apps. So the question then is, how do we express all this in these various different fields? And in academia, the courses we've talked about are examples for that. Or I can imagine graduate seminars in, let's say, conceptual research methodology, psychedelics, conceptual research methodology, meditation, and give people different perspectives on their fields. Now, these fields are being studied as topics and events to study, just like you'd study anything else, like say in psychology or sociology. But in addition to doing that, it's being able to use them as research methodologies. That's the big thing that counts. So what I would see is we just go through the culture and look at all the institutions and ask, how can X institution use psychedelics, Y institution use psychedelics, and so forth. And of course, by psychedelics, I mean all these other mind-body states. So what we're talking about is a much bigger view of what it means to be a human and what culture is and how we can develop ourselves and how we can develop culture. So I hope whatever special area people are interested in psychedelics, say psychotherapy or religion or medicine, they'll realize that this is a little slice of a much larger field, not only in psychedelics, but psychedelics are part of a much larger whole mind-body field. So that's the real idea behind all these particulars.
Well, thank you so much for your time today and sharing these ideas and helping us to sort our way through the quagmire that is our current policy and our current state of affairs within our culture, and also for helping to inject a little clarity and a little hope into the situation as well.
Thanks for inviting me. As you can tell, I love talking about this stuff.
Yeah, it's been great having you on. If you could remind our listeners once again about the book that this will be a part of.
Oh, okay. But let me mention 3 books. I presented this mind-body idea in a book called The Psychedelic Future of the Mind that was published about a year ago. And then on October 31st, the 2 volumes set on psychedelics and religion will be published, called Seeking the Sacred with Psychoactive Substances. It's an anthology. Some really good authors are in it. And sometime later this year, early next year, another anthology will be coming out that will be the Psychedelic Policy Quagmire.
And that's the book that this is going to be a chapter in.
Yeah. Oh, let me say, people can find some other chapters of this at my website. It's NIU, as in Northern Illinois University, niu.academia.edu/Thomas Roberts.
Yeah, and you've got a variety of different documents and PDF files, I think, available here on this site. So you've got anyone who wants lots of interesting reading, you've got it for them. Well, Thomas, it's been great having you on the show for today. Really appreciate having you back. It's nice to check in after a few years here, and definitely wish you the best with these forthcoming publications, and just extend thank you for doing this work. I think it's important, and it's great to see people like yourself out there doing it.
Thanks for inviting me. Bye.
All right.